Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. What we would like to talk to you about today is the initial steps of our journey at Imagia to build a collaboration ecosystem to help bring AI to healthcare. And right off the bat, please allow me to say, this is my very first talk in public, so if I seem nervous, it is because I am. Thank you. May we do a quick initial survey, just to get a feeling for you in the audience. May I ask those in the audience who work in healthcare to quickly raise their hand? Yeah, that's a good number. And who of those are actually involved in clinical research? That's less, right? And who is already deploying AI systems in production? Smaller. And last question in that direction, who is using AI in clinical research? Congratulations. And if we may ask one personal question, who in the audience knows someone who has been affected by cancer? It's a very large number. So without further ado, my name is Clemens Ortel, or for the ones who know German pronunciation, Clemens Oertel. I have been working as a program manager and software architect at Imagia, helping in its federation and traceability efforts.
Thanks, Clemens. Hi, everybody. My name is Jonathan Konevsky, and I'm a board-certified reconstructive surgeon based here in California, and I've been leading the team at Imagia in the area of clinical innovation. So, before we jump into our talk on data, AI, and healthcare, Clemens and I wanted to share with you some words from a healthcare visionary who really foreshadowed the explosion of big data in healthcare. Dr. Larry Weed, who you see up there, he coined the term knowledge couplers. He gave a famous ground rounds lecture in the Massachusetts General Hospital in 1960. And he believed that there was no way that doctors could possibly manage all the data that was related to a patient. He's responsible for creating today's concept of what is a medical record. And I just wanted to share with you what he had to say over 60 years ago about big data in healthcare.
What I'd like to do is go at this problem not from the point of view of the record. I mean, we really aren't taking care of records, we're taking care of people. And we're trying to get across the idea that this record cannot be separated from the caring of that patient. This is not something, the practice of medicine over here and the record over here. This is the practice of medicine. It's intertwined with it. It determines what you do in the long run. You're a victim of it, or you're a triumph because of it. The human mind simply cannot carry all the information about all the patients in the practice without error. And so
you can see that this idea that big data in healthcare is really not something that's novel. But here we are today, sitting almost 60 years later, discussing it. And I think Dr. Larry Weed would be completely ecstatic to know that we're making so much effort in healthcare and AI. So I'd like to tell you a bit about my experience and why I'm interested in health AI, and before I give you the background of our company, Imagia. My interest in AI started during residency, where as a surgical resident, I was exposed to a number of patients who were really suffering in the medical system. In particular, one patient, a young girl who died of metastatic breast cancer, who had a tumor that was completely missed by a screening mammogram. And I remember shortly after she passed away, I spent the evening poring through her mammograms, trying to find a tumor that just wasn't there, thinking that there's got to be some way that the human eye just isn't capturing what's clinically there. So I was lucky enough to meet a team of computer scientists at Imagia who were working on these problems and wanted to team up and try and find a way to bring AI solutions that would actually transform healthcare. So Imagia was founded in 2015. We're a company of more than 40 employees, and we have close ties to the Montreal AI ecosystem. We have a great relationship with the Montreal Institute for Learning Algorithms, one of the largest groups of postdocs doing research in AI in Canada. And we have active collaboration with over 5 hospitals in North America and Europe. So today, Clemens and I want to share with you our big picture mission. We also want to share with you some technical details as to how we are building an ecosystem that powers discovery for clinical applications. So how do we impact a patient's journey with AI? A good example that we are focusing on is lung cancer. From screening with X-ray or low-dose CT to later in the patient's journey with diagnosis and biopsy, then to treatment with targeted chemotherapies, and finally with surgery and then the long road to recovery. Each step of the patient's journey is important to us. Creating an AI tool for each step of the journey leads to a comprehensive care that focuses on value-based outcomes, such as quality of life, not just mortality. The first step of a patient's journey in the long road of what it means to be diagnosed with lung cancer is screening. Lung cancer is the leading cause of cancer-related death. Despite the best efforts made to screen the general population, mostly smokers, many patients with lung cancer do not smoke. Where we want to deliver the value of AI is detecting patients early, stage 1 disease, where it's most easily treated. Screening is usually the beginning of a patient journey that is filled with fear, many unknowns, and often made worse by the fact that many patients are diagnosed with advanced stage disease. Being diagnosed with late stage disease means you have almost a 20 times more likelihood of death. So finding the disease at an early stage is the best way to improve outcomes. Once that lung cancer is detected, the process of establishing a diagnosis is often a long, cumbersome process, followed by choosing the right treatment. So why is this process so time-consuming and confusing? Well, it's difficult to know. Should all patients be given the most expensive molecular tests right away? Should a patient be started on first-line therapy if they have advanced stage disease? Or should they be advanced to targeted immunotherapy right from the time of diagnosis? So in today's paradigm, there's really 2 ways to establish a diagnosis. It's either tissue biopsy, which is the current gold standard, or a liquid biopsy. Tissue biopsies are when a surgeon takes, or an oncologist will take a piece of tissue and send it to a pathologist. It's often not as good of a gold standard as we would imagine, because up to 40% of the time a repeat biopsy is needed, or the tissue that was taken wasn't sent for the right test to establish the right diagnosis. Up and coming is a technique called liquid biopsy. It's growing in popularity, and what it entails is taking and sampling blood from a patient and looking for bits of tumor DNA that has shed, much like a dog sheds hair. But as you can imagine, that also has its own problems. Just like there's dogs that shed a lot of hair and dogs that shed very little hair, not all tumors shed DNA equally. Up to 25% of these cancers don't shed DNA, which means a liquid biopsy would fail. So what's happening is that in many hospitals, in many clinical settings, that specialists, pathologists, oncologists, surgeons, despite their best efforts to communicate, they're functioning in silos. They're not interacting as closely as they should. And if we want to be successful in treating patients, we need to transcend these silos and use AI to accelerate diagnosis. After establishing a diagnosis, the next step in a patient's journey is optimizing treatment. Precision medicine initiated a revolution 15 years ago. However, it's yet to create the transformational change that impacts patients from day to day. For example, there are very few drugs that target known gene mutations for cancer, and we still don't have a good way of selecting patients for treatment for immunotherapy. The majority of patients that are diagnosed with cancer will not have the option to be treated with immunotherapy. This is because patients usually need to fail a first or a second-line treatment that is not tumor-specific before their tumor is rebiopsied and to see if it can be targeted by a specific immunotherapy. Even when patients are put on the right immunotherapy, as much as 90% of those patients will have tumors that are resistant to the disease, resistant to the drug. And that's because there's small cohorts of cancer cells within that population that are just resistant. So with our platform, what we hope to do is empower physicians to use AI to identify features invisible to the eye that could help guide patients to the appropriate therapy and avoid dangerous and expensive biopsies and molecular tests. One example of where this plays is in the area of deep radiomics. So radiomics is an evolving field where we believe that there's information captured in the image that is just not accessible to the human eye. Patterns that relate to disease. For example, is there a specific morphology to a tumor that could indicate its genetic status? Could a lung cancer be EGFR positive just based on its radiomic fingerprint? Where this comes into play is in immunotherapy. So by show of hands, who had lunch today? Most people here, but some people may have skipped lunch, some people may have skipped breakfast. But if I asked everybody here to run a marathon, everybody would perform differently. The same way, if I was to give an immunotherapy to everybody who was able to take that immunotherapy, their bodies would react differently. Because everybody's immune system has a different makeup. And in immunotherapy for cancer, you need your immune system to be primed appropriately to combine with that immunotherapy to target the cancer. So this is why many immunotherapies fail or have such a varied range of results, because we don't know the state of somebody's immune system as well as we should before that immunotherapy is given. This is where deep radiomics can have an effect and give insights where we didn't have them before. Can we train our AI models on CTs or MRIs combined with pathology information from immunohistochemistry to identify patients' immune status before we give them immunotherapy, so we know when is the ideal time to give an immunotherapy to achieve the best result. So finally, patients have been screened, they've been diagnosed, their treatment has been delivered in an optimal fashion, but now begins the long road to recovery. Chemotherapy can leave patients with heart problems, gastrointestinal issues, skin damage. Radiotherapy causes irreversible damage to the skin and the immune system. If you think about it, we're really living in an age where people are surviving their cancer, but now suffering more from the treatment of the cancer than the disease itself. Treating cancer is a noble and monumental achievement, but now we must also focus on minimizing the morbidity that comes with cancer. To transform this delivery of care, we have to treat beyond a given disease and focus on developing treatment strategies that can minimize harm to the patient based on their unique biological makeup. As we build our discovery platform to power clinical adoption, it's important to remember just how imperfect the medical training system is. Information is constantly evolving in academic silos around the world, and the main medium for sharing this information is through publications in journals. As a doctor, I can tell you it's nearly impossible for a physician today to remain accurately up to date on the latest advances in medical science. And it's even more difficult to actually employ these advances into medical practice. So building a platform that makes use of federated medical data across the network will bring us one step closer to understanding some of the randomness we observe. So before we shift gears from the medical to technical side of the talk, I just want to leave you with this point, which is what we're trying to build at Imagia is an ecosystem where we empower doctors to bring their clinical expertise to create clinical adoption, and we bring AI expertise to bring about discovery, and ultimately together to make AI that transforms healthcare. So I'm going to pass the mic over to Clemens now to share with you a bit of how this magic happens and the technical details.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. So, based on what Jonathan just showed us, we at Imagia believe that AI tasks related to clinical questions are best formulated by clinicians themselves. However, most clinicians are not AI experts. And that is exactly what we're trying to enable clinicians to do with the platform that we're currently building at Imagia based on Google Cloud Platform. Namely, to use AI in a clinician's discoveries without having to know about the details of AI. Jonathan already mentioned a few of the possible questions in the clinical field where AI might come in handy, such as, could we predict the efficacy of a certain treatment for one particular patient, not for a big statistical base, but for one patient, based on information that has been acquired early in the continuum of care? Today, most of the time, we have standard treatment plans. We apply the most commonly applicable treatment first, and only if that doesn't work do we go on to the more advanced, more costly treatments. And this might make sense from a cost perspective, from a public health perspective, but for an individual patient, this might not be the best approach. Also, could we determine the malignancy of a tumor just based on early imaging, such as the EGFR status of a tumor? This way, a clinician could choose the right treatment early on. Or to express it more generally, can we predict patient outcome based on raw data acquired early in the continuum of care? To answer these questions, one usually conducts a retrospective clinical study. And to give you a little bit of a background, to conduct such a study, the first step is normally to build a patient cohort for that study and for that outcome. To build a patient cohort means to find suitable patients based on past diagnostic or treatment results, such as a drug worked or did not work, tumor was malignant or benign. And that usually involves going through vast amounts of clinical records, textual records. This is actually clinicians sitting there, sifting through these records, finding the right records, the right patients, because these records are not structured for that kind of questioning. And that's a tedious, laborsome task. And one of the toolkit or tooling that we at Imagia developed to assist in this is based on NLP and active learning. A clinician can just tag a few reports. We then can go through all the records that there are, find the best matches based on these early selections, and this way build up a larger cohort. And of course, unfortunately, this has to be happening on premise because we do need access to the full data corpus at the hospital. The next step, just as difficult, is to find the corresponding imaging data, because remember, we want to be able to, based on very early imaging that was acquired before we even knew what's happening to that patient, to make a prediction about a very late outcome. And unfortunately, as Jonathan already pointed out, this data lives in different silos. To connect that data is not a trivial task. And this is another step where AI can help us to find, for a given set of patients, the corresponding data for an outcome in question. And one thing we hope to come out of this is that instead of running on dozens or hundreds of patients per clinical study, we can actually scale this up to thousands of patients and beyond. Overall, this is going from patient-structured data really to outcome-structured data, which is just the way how data is not organized in hospitals right now. But now, this is where it starts getting really interesting. Because once we have this patient cohort, in this overall overview here, what we're trying to do, or what we're doing, is we're sending this data to the cloud component of our platform, which we're building on Google Cloud Platform. And here we run an automated, large-scale biomarker discovery process to find evidence for signals in that data that correlates with the outcome in question. The goal at this time is not to find a highly accurate classifier just yet, but really to provide statistical validation of that evidence for such a signal. And this discovery process is entirely driven by the clinician. Right? There is no AI expertise involved at that time. And this allows the clinician to undergo this as an iterative process. For example, you might try at first to predict an outcome based on a low-dose CT that was very early taken, but it might turn out that in the low-dose CT, you just don't have this kind of information that you're looking for. And this way, you can very easily do another iteration where you then bring in CTs that were taken later in the continuum of care. Once we are sufficiently satisfied that we have such evidence in our data, this is where the collaborative aspect of our platform can kick in. Namely, we can collaborate with other clinicians from different hospitals to enlarge the patient base, to make sure more subpopulations are covered more thoroughly. And we can collaborate with AI researchers, AI experts, to start looking into building a highly optimized classifier for that biomarker, or a detector for that biomarker in question. And once this has been accomplished, and this is a part that is a little bit beyond the scope of this talk, productization process can be undergone to really produce a clinical-grade biomarker in the end that can truly affect patient care. So if you allow me to go a little bit more into detail how this discovery process looks like. So as Jonathan already said, it's based on recent advancements in a field called radiomics, where the idea is to use image features which are hidden to the human eye to directly deduce a patient outcome. To do that, we bring the imaging data together with the output information, the outcome information into Google Cloud. Here, as example, we have an image of a pre-segmented liver, but this really is just a representation of a patient data set, a bigger patient data set. And afterwards, we apply a suite of pre-trained independent feature extractors to that data. And for possible examples here for these feature extractors, to give you an idea, is those could be models that look for a blob with a fuzzy context, or a blob into which a lot of lines lead into. But all of these feature extractors, they are not outcome specific. They can be used for any kind of outcomes. And there we have thousands of them that we all apply, every feature extractor to every single item in the input data. And each feature extractor will present us afterwards with an individual result. We have a colorful map here to showcase it a little bit better, but in the end, those are just numeric values on a continuous scale. All of these results are then aggregated, and this allows us to find the set of features which best correlates with the outcome in question. And this set of features would be our preliminary biomarker. And just to reiterate, the goal is really here to look for the evidence of such signals corresponding to the features, not necessarily the best possible accuracy at that time. Just to give it a little bit of a technical twist, how we implemented that on Google Cloud. We upload the data into Google Cloud Storage. We do run a front end in the front based on Kubernetes engine, which then sends all this data into this multitude of either sort of TensorFlow models or extractors of other kinds for which we could use Kubernetes engine or Cloud Functions. The idea here really is to make use of the scalability that we get out of this, to have on-demand scalability to run this amount of computation, and for the results then we utilize BigQuery to run our analysis and present the result back to the clinician. Now, when we're talking about feature extractors and models, etc., in the clinical context, there are a few peculiarities about medical data that one really needs to be aware about. It is different data. First of all, we have highly imbalanced data sets. That means we're looking for a needle in the haystack. So Jonathan mentions the example of screening, where we're looking for a few patients who are affected by a disease in a population of very, very many. And this gets even worse for rare diseases. Also, what we're trying to predict is potential treatment efficacy for people for whom the standard treatment would not work. So those are rather the rare cases. Also, we are dealing with very tiny lesions in large data. So for example, those are examples of pulmonary embolisms. One there, one there. I mean, honestly, this is a few gray pixels in a bunch of a lot more gray pixels. That's not an easy one to find. And to make matters worse, this data tends to be not 2, but 3 or 4-dimensional for longitudinal studies. So a lot of the standard machine learning pre-processing steps, such as scaling down your data, it just won't work because you pretty much lose all the information. To make matters worse, we have a lot of variability in our data. Certain features, certain context can manifest itself differently depending on age, ethnicity, gender, genotype, but also anamnesis of a patient. For example, we're talking about trying to find the non-smokers in a screening process, but if we train our model primarily with smokers, most of them might exhibit certain secondary symptoms, such as emphysema. So we have to make sure that our model doesn't just pick up on the emphysema, but really goes for what we're looking for. And there are a lot of device-specific artifacts in these images. So what we see here, this is not how an imaging modality really acquires an image. In the case of an MRI, we're dealing with disturbances in the magnetic field. This is just a visual representation for human consumption. The process of going from the real physical data to the visual data, this is manufacturer-specific, and those are artifacts that we need to account for. Luckily, we're not left without tools. So we very often deploy a mechanism called curriculum learning, for example, to deal with tiny lesions or imbalanced data. The idea behind curriculum learning is that you really start with a model that trains on a very small subset, on a patch of the data, and then as the model learns this, we continuously increase the amount of data, the amount of context that we present to the model. It works just as well for imbalanced data sets. We can start with a rather balanced data set and then go to imbalanced bit by bit. To account for the variability and vendor-specific artifacts, we just have to have enough data to have a sufficient representation of all these problems in our data set. But what I'm trying to get at is that we're dealing with a lot of data, and we're dealing with models that are deep, that are complex, that need a long time to learn. And this was one of the reasons for us to go on to Google Cloud with this problem, because here, of course, we can make use of the near infinite amount of resources. And especially for us, TensorFlow ML Engine TPUs, this whole stack works really well to address the complexity of our models, because we get both the data parallelism and the model parallelism with reasonably low effort. Now, when I was talking about feature extractors, which are used by clinicians for this discovery process, I mentioned that they're pre-trained models, which of course raises the question, how are these models trained? How are they built? How can AI experts collaborate with clinicians to build such feature extractors? And this is one of the use cases for our proprietary platform, which we call evidence. A bit of additional information. When working with clinical data, as I'm sure all of you who work in healthcare know, working with clinical data is highly regulated. Some of the regulatory frameworks are HIPAA, now GDPR, Health Canada has their own. And I don't want to give an exhaustive overview, I cannot give legal advice. But what it boils down to for us is this. First of all, we of course have to anonymize the data. HIPAA, for example, provides a list of fields that needs to be removed before data can leave on the hospital's premises. And we need to apply anonymization, the identification of the data, which means assigning random identifiers rather than using the original hospital-generated ones. But it does not stop there. Data for clinical research can only be used based on patient consent and institutional approval. There are IRB, ERBs, it stands for Institutional or Ethics Review Board, depending on where one lives. And they grant ethics approval for clinical studies. The problem with this consent and those approvals is that they can be revoked. So a patient could walk into a hospital and say, yeah, I gave past consent for this clinical study, but I changed my mind. And in the case of such a revocation, we have to be able to delete the patient's data, but also, to be on the safe side, any kind of derived data. This can be something simple, such as I had a CT scan and I cropped it and saved this crop. But this could also be something more complicated, especially in the context of machine learning, where models are represented by weights. Weights are affected by the patient's data that went into the training process. Now, if you're thinking about models such as autoencoders and generative models, it's hard to guarantee that there is not some detailed information about that patient inside a model that would allow to regenerate the patient's data. So to be on the safe side, we said we even want to delete those weights in the case of such a revocation. Of course, being able to revoke means we have to actually trace all of this in the first place. We have to make sure we know for every single patient what happened to his or her data in the cloud. And this does not just mean the data once it gets uploaded, but also any subsequent processing step that we might apply to the data. And to give a fairly high-level overview of how we achieve this in GCP is there we go. So we upload data from hospitals into the cloud. We run a data ingestion process, which brings the data into a data lake. But before any kind of operation is happening on a piece of data, we always make sure we create a trace log entry that records for which patient, what data has been done what to. Any kind of data processing that we run in the cloud, we first create a dedicated data set for, which is which means we create a Google Cloud Storage bucket into which we copy data out of our data lake to make sure no single process can ever access this data lake. This is really a highly secured data storage that nobody has access to. For every process, we create a dedicated data set, and this is something for us very easy to trace. And it's easy to show that this works reliably, because only what goes into this data set can be accessed by the data processing step. Data processing, this could be image pre-processing, model training, anything like this. Any kind of output produced by a data processing step, such as cropped images or model weights, go in a Google Cloud Storage bucket, which has been specifically created for that operation, which again in itself is linked back to all of the input data and sufficiently traced. So we have really a traceability chain from every bit of patient data throughout our entire system to any kind of result that we store. And if you allow me to go a little bit more into detail on the first piece of this puzzle, the data ingestion, the first step happens on-premise, where we receive a cohort and then we upload it into an inbox which is hospital-specific. We can make use here of service accounts which are specific to the hospital. And so only this hospital has access to this inbox. We have an ingestion process which then copies the data into our data lake only after making sure that the proper trace log entries are being created. One thing that we also did to the inbox is we created auto-deletion rules, because when a patient revocation request comes in, you have a certain amount of time to comply with that request. And we really tried to build in robustness from the beginning. So what if this ingester doesn't run and the data just sits in this inbox bucket as an orphan? If a patient revocation request came in, this data would still exist, we would have a problem. So we just delete this data after a couple of days automatically. But not to the real meat of the matter. How can our AI researchers use our platform for their everyday work? And our goal here was to give maximum flexibility to AI researchers. And often that involves running not just single trainings, but long workflows with multiple stages and conditional steps of pre-processing, training, analysis, visualization, etc. So we want to enable researchers to do this while still maintaining full control over the data and ensuring traceability. And the overall idea for us was, we don't have the mountain come to the prophet, but the prophet to the mountain, which means that we have a secured area where all the data storage and execution is happening, and any kind of processing step, be it a training, data pre-processing, is encapsulated as a container or a zip file containing ML Engine code, and then submitted along with a query into our system, where we run this query on the data service and produce a data bucket, which I mentioned before, which is given to the training. The training runs on that data and produces all the output in an output bucket, which can then be re-ingested for subsequent use by later stages in that workflow. And again, one of the important things here is that each one of these steps, each one of these arrows leads to according entries in our trace log, which means even for this derived data that gets re-ingested into the data lake, we always know which original patient that came from. A few other Google techniques that we use is we have per training or per process service accounts, which are the only ones then allowed to access this bucket. This way we can really make sure that every training can only access the data it's supposed to, but at the same time that every bit of data we have can only be accessed by the training that's supposed to access this data. And by linking every data along this way back to the original individual patient data and the identified patient identifier, we can maintain that requirement of traceability. Starting to go a little bit faster because I'm noticing we're running a little bit short on time. We then, on top of this, to make it really easy to use, created a lot of CLIs and front ends and run it as function as a service and cloud functions to model these workflows. And one example I wanted to give is we have one project which involves colonoscopy, where we receive colonoscopy videos from which we have to extract frames. These frames have to be prepared. We have to identify the type of lighting that was used, for which we have our own models to do this. Then there is some manual tagging involved by clinicians. And only after all of this can we actually start building cohorts, because only then do we know what we're dealing with. So then we can build cohorts and then feed this into training. And each one of these steps undergoes this full loop. So that final model that comes out of this training, we can still trace back to every single video that might have affected that model. And of course, the reason why we're going through all this hassle is to ensure revocability. And as I said before, a patient might walk any day into the hospital and say, I gave you consent, but I changed my mind. I want you to undo this. It has to happen on premise, because we have to look up the de-identified identifier, but the important piece is really we send this request into the cloud, where we run this process that we call Nomen est Omen Revoker. And this process can then use all this information that we previously stored in the trace log to identify every single location of related data to that patient, be it our data lake, indices, any kind of bucket, running trainings, metadata. Anything can be deleted, or will be deleted, sorry. And a report will be generated, which is then sent back to the hospital. And that's just one of the requirements, that we have to have this full loop from the on-premise through the cloud back to the hospital. Now, to bridging back to the biomarker discovery process, of course, all these feature extractors that we mentioned before are models that have been trained through this platform. Those are models that are deployed, that run somewhere, that are used for the biomarker discovery process. In the case of such a revocation, what this allows us to do is to automatically retrain the affected models, just in this case without the data of that one patient that just issued a revocation request. We can retrain these models, making sure all accuracy requirements for every possible subpopulation are still being met, and then automatically redeploy this model, and this way kind of ensuring a continuous service for our biomarker discovery platform. So this is where we are today. Ongoing work that we're currently pursuing is that we really want to improve the trustability of our platform. We want to make it easy for patients to trust the platform that we're building, to make people comfortable when they contribute to clinical studies. Because one obvious thing, no talk in this time and age can live without mentioning blockchain, is to use blockchain. And one of the areas where we think it could really be beneficial is to use blockchain's capabilities as an immutable ledger, where we can issue receipts to patients and hospitals saying, yes, we received this data, or we received this revocation request. And there would be no way to wriggle out of that responsibility that comes with this data or that revocation request. In the end, is it the solution to all our problems? Probably not. And if anybody in the audience has any ideas, I would love to talk about that after the talk. I don't know how to model deletion with blockchain. How do I guarantee that something has been deleted and there's no copy anywhere left of it? So there's always a component of trust left in such a system. You have to trust the system, or you have to trust the company, or you have to trust the regulator, or you have to trust the blockchain implementation. A fully trustless system, not, but we can really try to improve trust for patients and hospitals. We're also looking into implementing certain cryptographic guarantees, proxy re-encryption, to be able to say we can use cryptography to guarantee that only certain processes can access the data that they are supposed to access. And one next step of that could be, this could allow us to really further patient engagement by modeling that process of consent through cryptographic guarantees, where a patient, by re-encrypting a key specific to a certain clinical study or training to be done, with their own key, could explicitly give their consent to that clinical study. Now, we've been talking a lot about data, and in the context of data, mainly about patient data, but there's more to it. All of these consents and authorizations, they have data associated with themselves. Those are forms, processes, and we would like to model this as well to really be able to give a holistic end-to-end view of the different processes that are involved on clinical sites with respect to traceability, data in the cloud, and revocability. And we believe that there are certain areas where the centralized learning in the cloud might not be as suitable or even impossible. For example, if you want to run a machine learning operation on data that requires data that otherwise, or information that otherwise gets removed through the anonymization process, it's almost not possible to run this in the cloud. So for these few cases, we are looking into federated learning where data could stay on premise and we only keep the control in the cloud. But of course, this is a less desirable approach just due to the hardware maintenance and all of these headaches. Yeah, I give back to
Thanks,
Jonathan.
Thomas. So I'm pretty sure if Dr. Larry Weed was to time travel from the 60s, he would, his head would spin with the complexity of how important it is to think about some of the things we're thinking about. But ultimately, what we, to summarize what we've wanted to share with you is our approach to create this collaboration ecosystem, which is powered by the Google Cloud, where we bring together health experts, engineering experts, in a way where they can not only use AI without, health experts can use AI without the knowledge of AI, but to do so on a large, impactful scale across a large network. So thank you very much for your time, and we'd be happy to take any questions.